I mean, people would actually talk about it in the party by that point, by sort of 1961.
It's interesting to imagine what Orwell might have made of it had he lived.
Yeah, I think he could have been wearing a bit of a smug face for calling it.
Well, because he'd been cynical about
basically called it
communism for some time, hadn't he?
Yeah, well, if he wrote 1984 in 1948, then he called it. And incidentally, going off on a little bit of a diversion, but there are elements of the Ministry of Truth and stuff that ring true about the sort of censorship we're going through at the moment, sort of.
In Britain?
Yeah, or in the West. Anyway. Around this time, people... I mentioned before that slogans were just written on walls a lot, and there would be like banners put up with party slogans and things. But the counter to that, the riposte to that, I suppose, would be that dissidents, usually in the middle of the night, would put up sort of night flyers or night posters, or even write a wall essay denouncing the party or saying it how it is. And of course, that was a pretty bad crime that you could be disappeared for. But that happened increasingly more in the early 60s, whereas it hadn't happened at all really before that. I think I mentioned before that Mao wanted everyone, a good revolutionary, to write poems. Everyone should write poems, and there were millions and millions of poems written, mostly just, anodyne crap. But some of them were satirical and good, apparently, and funny, taking the piss. Yeah, the fact that there is evidence that it is possible to have a sense of humour, or even a dark sense of humour in the worst of times. I mean, one of them I just remember, of course it's in translation so it won't rhyme or anything like that, but it was saying something along the lines of, isn't it great that the canteens have made us all fat now? Meaning their distended bellies from famine edema. Yeah, dark humour. And rumour apparently was a really important thing. It's hard for us, I think, to imagine, because we're used to, if not the actual internet world where everyone's got sort of WhatsApp or whatever, but even before that we're used to a world that was pretty connected up, where rumour wasn't really a problem. There wouldn't be sort of a word of mouth rumour sweeping through that, I don't know, for example, a foreign army is coming. You don't know if it's true or not, but you better react to it, because if it is true, rumour still had massive power in those days. Like, there'd be a rumour, for example, that Chiang Kai-shek was coming back, and it would be okay, and it'd beat the communists. And
he didn't come back.
No, he didn't. No, but when there'd be rumours that would sweep the country, and then so the propaganda machine would have to push back harder to reinforce, even in their minds, even more the party line and obedience to the state. And there was sort of a back and forth, sort of a war of rumours. Like one time there was a rumour that Mao had died, and loads of people thought it was true, and that would herald, a changing of the guard, so to speak, and that they would be allowed a little more slack. And it turns out it wasn't true, and they got cracked down on even harder. Or, I mean, there was a few, talk about rebellions, there were really few small attempts at it, but they were easily crushed by the party. But there would be rumours that a big rebellion had happened and was successful, and it was coming north, and it just wasn't true. But one of the reasons why rebellions never worked, a few reasons. One, the main one, is that there's no alternative to the communists, no, actual feasible, workable alternative. If they were somehow removed, there would be, well, I suppose true anarchy or something like it. I don't know. There would be no.
Well, they could have made a sudden, immediate switch to anarcho-capitalism. But just by default, I mean. Dissolve the state and then just see what happens. They'd be better off economically. They might destroy themselves in some way.
Well, it's funny, but in a way, Maoist China during the Great Leap Forward was a bit like an anarcho-capitalist state.
You just couldn't.
Because that was all that was left to do. Like, the canteens closed after a while. They just closed, so.
You must fend for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, so politics was in command. There was no recourse to the law. I mentioned before that the Ministry of Justice was closed down in sort of 1959 because Mao said, I haven't got the exact quote, but he said something along the lines of, like, my word is the law. Or he says something like, the party, you should not listen to the judiciaries, the party is what you should listen to. When we make decrees, that is the law, or something like that. And so the militias were sort of the rule of law, not the police. There were still police stations and things, but the judiciary had entirely collapsed, apparently, by sort of 59. Any sort of idea of litigation is just meaningless. All you've got is you can still write letters or petitions to the party, which may or may not ever even be seen, let alone acted upon. But again, it would come down to your personal networks. If you could ever get someone who's high up enough to give it to the right person to ever actually action anything.
And if it's not obsequious, you've got quite a good chance of getting blacklisted and taken away and whatever.
Yeah, it could get you disappeared, sent to a labour camp, yeah, certainly. So there was this tradition, even in the imperial period, that anyone could petition the emperor. Like, again, as if he ever personally ever read these things or anything, or ever. But there was a tradition of it in China that anyone could just send a letter to Dear Chairman Mao, and they did. I mean, loads did, thousands, tens of thousands did. Yeah, and once in a blue moon, like, the party would put together an investigation team and go there and find the sort of evil carder that had been talked about and remove him and make an example of him. Most of the time it was either ignored, or you were then, singled out for being a counter-revolutionary or a rightist or something, for daring to question. So a whole range of things, usually bad, but not always. But that's what characterises communist China, really, I think, is that the whole range of things played out. It was nearly always disastrous, but not always. Sometimes occasionally there were decent human beings, you know. Another thing that's really surprising is that it seems from accounts that most people, most rural peasants anyway, believed that the famine was a local thing to their area. They didn't know that it was going on a vast scale. They always assumed it must just be their little area that sort of dropped the ball. In a lot of the letters, they say that. And they had that thing, you know, if only Mao knew, he would do something about it, you know, like a lot of the Germans thought that if only Hitler knew they didn't have warm clothes, he'd go mad and do something about it. It's just not really.
But he had bad people around him or whatever.
Yeah, it was sort of his evil advisors. So yeah, robbery was just endemic. Lots and lots of trains got held up, sometimes just by farmers, a lot by farmers, and just their sheer weight of numbers could overpower any guards on trains that were chock full of goods or food, state requisitioned food and stuff. So that happened tons around this time, sort of 59, 60, 61. Granaries, that was one of the main targets of sort of, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but like vigilante violence or just stealing back what had been taken from them. The state, re-requisitioned in the state granaries. Yeah, they were pilfered or just destroyed if they couldn't just get it back. On the big scale, though, it happened relatively unusual. Though it did happen, but considering it didn't happen that much. The Chinese got a saying called eating bitterness, which just means sort of dealing with or enduring hardship. Sort of as a nation, I think, used to eating bitterness. The Moaist period is just, you know, one of the modern ones.
But probably the worst.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah. And Cotter calls it, quote, absorbing grief, accepting pain and living with loss on a devastating scale. I mentioned earlier that arson and fires were a big thing, and in a few provinces, it's mad, there's like 10 a day. It seems like there was a campaign by someone, reading between the lines, to burn down sort of loads of state granaries and things.
I mean, did they help? Did they think that maybe it would help bring down the regime?
Maybe it's a type of rebellion.
That did happen under Stalin as well. Even at the peak of the terror, apparently people were still sabotaging things.
Yeah. And so it shows that their paranoia about saboteurs isn't entirely unfounded.
No. It's always exaggerated how paranoid they were.
Yeah.
There was that, and there was actually loads of real counter-revolutionary.
I mean,
sabotage.
on that, Dakota calls it Dakota says, quote, by 1961, pyromania possessed the countryside, end quote. So it really is a thing. But most rebellions, or people that wanted to try and rebel, would find it difficult because they were simply too weak. By the time you find yourself in a real famine situation, survival situation, in a land ravaged by famine, you're probably too weak to make it to the next village, let alone pick up a rifle and start marching and fighting.
And the people you're fighting will be better fed and
better
armed and everything.
Yeah. But Tibet, there was a big uprising in 1959. I mean, that's the uprising when the Dalai Lama flees. So Tibet has got a long history of sticking it to the CCP. Yeah. And even some communes rebel in 1961 before they more or less completely collapse. I mean, you talked about religion earlier, and it did actually, according to some statistics, grow during this period, simply because it's something to turn to, and the state didn't aggressively force people to give up all religion. Even some cadres in some areas would, visit temples and stuff. So that was never really a top priority to like in the Marxist sense, or stamp out religion. I mean, it probably wouldn't have been possible, but not that stopped them trying to kill sparrows or anything. But yeah, and even after there was some purges in the army, the full army, the PLA in 1959, they purged it. So the army was not really an option as a body that could force the party out. So with the people pretty much too weak and divided to get together in a full rebellion, the army out of the picture, the party itself quieted by Mao, and there being no alternative anyway, meant that despite the Great Leap Forward, the party still wasn't ever toppled. There was no opposition.
No one could manage any.
Yeah. Dakota writes, quote, the most common technique of self-help in times of mass starvation was a simple device called hope. And hope dictated that however bad the situation was in the village, Mao had the best interests of his people at heart. A common conviction in imperial times was that the emperor was benevolent, but his servants could be corrupt. Even more so in the People's Republic, the population had to reconcile a vision of utopia, trumpeted by the media, with the everyday reality of catastrophe on the ground. The belief that cadres who were abusive failed to carry out the orders of the beneficent chairman was widespread. A distant entity called the government and a semi-god called Mao were on the side of good. If only he knew, everything would be different. End quote. I think there's still some Reds today who like LARPing as communists, who still would say that sort of thing, who would believe that he was beneficent.
There are still Maoists around. Not many. But...
Well, you don't have to be a full Maoist. You just need to be like some sort of champagne socialist type.
Or Diane Abbott.
Yeah, or someone doesn't really know what they're talking about, like Diane Abbott, yeah. Just throws words out there. But yeah, I mentioned earlier the sort of exodus of people from the country to the cities. Because especially if you're a sort of a young, strong man and you can leave, you just bloody well do. Even if you've got to leave your family behind. I mean, you might be able to make some money and send it back. I mean, this story is not new. So loads of people, especially younger men, sort of left these communes in droves or beforehand. It's been called a migration of tidal dimensions. In 1958 alone, 15 million people move into the cities. Over the next 4 or 5 years, it's like, 20, 30, 40 million. Lots and lots. Like a true mass migration. The cities obviously can't deal with it and sort of explode in various ways. This is all despite the formal restrictions that the party had in place. The very real sort of firewall they try and put between rural people and the cities. It's all sort of bypassed in every possible way you can imagine. And then they go through different periods of sort of trying to clear the cities and boot out loads of the rural people that are there illegally, and then they come back again, and that goes on quite a few times. So yeah, like a great underclass emerges in these urban landscapes, sort of a shadowy underclass of like not fully legal urban dwellers, just eking by and it gets worse and worse for them as time goes on, but it's probably better than their village where, well, you would just lay on the floor of your hut and starve to death. That's all that was there. So trying your luck at keep getting thrown out of the cities is better, you know. Working in a factory for almost nothing is better than that, just about.
Is there any mention of people trying to flee China?
Oh yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. Yeah. That's totally punishable by death as well.
Right.
Like probably some torture and then death if you do that. So a twilight zone of legality sort of grew up around these rural people that were trying to get into cities or work in cities, or did do. You know, that they could be rounded up and just sent, like, outed by anyone and sent back to the countryside at any moment. It was sort of quite a precarious way to live. I mean, in the end, the party put a cap on the number of people that could be in certain cities at certain times. And if it was more than that, they would just sweep through and try and send all people back, locking them into a deadly famine, obviously, and send them back, yeah. And as I said before, there was sort of a wide range of reactions to that. A few carders would want to send some of their people off to the cities because it's less mouths for them to feed. It might alleviate the famine where they are a little bit if, you know, a bunch of the people leave. But that's the exception to the rule. They sound like actual humane people. Most carders would want to lock you down to your local area. And if you starve to death, so be it. But they weren't going to have the stain on their reputation of
having let people escape the collective.
Yeah, exactly. And there was a big market in human labour. You know, the sort of thing where builders will turn up somewhere really early in the morning and the foreman will say, I need 5 guys today. And there's 20 guys there and he picks who he picks. I don't know how, but you know, that sort of thing that goes on. Mm-hmm. So it was that on a massive scale, on an unbelievable scale. And the degree of exploitation, as you can imagine, was through the roof, to the point where in the end you weren't getting paid at all if you was one of these sort of rural people trying to make it in the city. You were just maybe given lodgings. You weren't given any wages or any coupons or anything. So it's rough. It's really rough. I mean, they're basically refugees flooding in from the famished countryside. And like, as I mentioned, the cordon sanitaire around the bigger cities just weren't up to doing what they were supposed to do. But yeah, I mean, it would have been and this is millions of people we're talking about, and it's like a very marginal existence in the shadows. You know, horrible. And the state sort of saw you as a threat to the social order. If anything, you know, you weren't welcome. Wasn't there a bit in Free West Berlin or something, where they would accept anyone that could get over from East Berlin was sort of totally welcome.
Right up until the moment that they closed the border and built the wall, people were just flooding across. Yeah.
And they were welcome in West Berlin.
Yeah, and given stuff immediately and like encouraged to stay. Yeah.
So this was the opposite. They really weren't. They were seen as a pest, like an actual pest
in their own land.
Yeah. Yeah, and basically treated as slave labour in many ways.
It makes me wonder as well. You say like something around 20, 30, 40 million people died.
Mm-hmm. I
wonder how many people just endured famine. Like hundreds of millions, maybe?
Yeah, most of the people, in China, went hungry at some point. I mean, there's stories of even, not the really high up leadership, but people in the party, in some places, they end up destitute because it really has taken everything from everyone in some places.
So it's a ravaging of the whole people, apart from the tiny elite.
I mean, so the countryside was effectively quarantined as though it was sort of full of lepers, and there's just loads of ghost villages left behind. And Frank Dicotta talks about that there would have been, or must have been, or accounts talk of a mass feeling of worthlessness, that you had been forsaken in sort of the grandest sense. And remember, the revolution was meant to be for the peasants, wasn't it? They would set up along the roadside, the party set up what they called dissuasion stations, or sometimes custody and deportation stations, where they would find people trying to flee their communes and well, you don't want to get caught at a dissuasion station, put it that way. If you was a woman, you'd probably be raped and or gang raped. And whether you was a man or a woman, you'd be thoroughly beaten, maybe beaten to death. So it's bad news to get caught by that. And I really can't quite believe it, but apparently they still exist in China today. I don't imagine they're anywhere near as sort of brutally violent or anything, but apparently they do exist.
Or because they're still trying to discourage people from moving to the cities.
I think so, or just moving within China, sort of willy-nilly, I don't think is entirely allowed. But during the Great Leap Forward, these dissuasion stations were really quite something. Oh, of course you'd have everything taken off of you, stolen from you. You might not be just sent back to your village or farm. You might be sent to a re-education camp or even a labour camp. So it wasn't good.
Or kept as a sex slave.
Maybe. Some cadres did seem to use their villagers as something along those lines. Yeah, like these escapees, if you were caught, that you're like the perfect victim. Like you have no recourse to anything. Yeah, you're just like a ball of yarn being played with by an adult Bengal tiger, you know. Like, but yeah, I suppose life on the road was better than just eating mud and then dying of constipation on the floor of your hut, which was probably what was waiting for you if you just stayed put.
It's worth trying to go somewhere and do something.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and you know, many, especially near the border regions, do try and leave China altogether. Loads try and get to Vietnam, Burma, the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, and Hong Kong are the main ones. But if you were caught and returned, that was bad. You'd probably be executed for that. That the party really, really hated people that tried to leave, because to them it was just ultimate proof that you weren't on board with the socialist dream. And no one really helped these escapees or refugees. So, like, the UN at this stage didn't even recognise Communist China still. So their official line was like, well, we'd probably like to do something about it, but seeing as we don't even recognise them, we can't really... It was just nothing. It was just bullshit UN nothing talk. And obviously the British controlled Hong Kong, and at one point, before the CCP cracked down, there was something like 5,000 people a day trying to get into Hong Kong, across the river, that big river that separates Hong Kong off from the mainland. And we pretty much sent them all back. We like had a small quota that we said we'd take, and we stuck quite rigidly to that. And other places did the same, more or less the same.
Did any flee to Taiwan?
Some did, yeah. But not many. They had their quota, really small quota. And imagine if you're Chiang Kai-shek, or you're a Taiwanese person, or someone who'd gone over there in 1949. Why would you help? Yeah. Why would you help out these, to you, what would be your enemy? Why are you expected to help them now? But it's just the common humanity. You would think you might do something. But no, I mean, everyone seemed to do the bare minimum, basically. Okay. So yeah, the vulnerable got it the worst. So obviously children, there were like state kindergartens and nurseries, but they were terrible. Like, do you remember, was it in the 80s or the 90s when there was like, it would always come out in the news about terrible Romanian
orphanages?
Romanian orphanages for some reason were like the absolute pits. Do you remember that?
There was particular reasons for that, yeah.
Right. So anyway, that's the picture I have whenever I read about these Chinese orphanages and nurseries and state-run kindergartens, and because the idea was that the families would give up their babies and toddlers and little kids because they had to go work in the fields or go build a dam or something. So the state would look after them, and they would, like everything else, run terribly, really understaffed, under-provisioned, and just no one gave a crap. Like all the lots and lots of food that was meant for the little kids was just taken by the adults that worked there and stuff, because their families were starving, they were starving. So yeah, it was just terrible until they eventually, like by 1961 or whatever, just mainly folded. People would come back and get their heavily damaged, if not malnutritioned kid, if they even survived. Like loads of these kids died, little kids. And yeah, a lot of the time you was forced to give up your child so that you could go and toil in the fields. Yeah, and the kids just suffered from really terrible neglect and diseases.
And separated from their parents.
Yeah, yeah. And there were a lot fewer born, actually, in this time. Obviously, in a way. I think maybe no one was counting, but how many, newborn babies would have died. there's just one more uncounted horror of the Great Leap Forward that you could quite easily imagine was, again, millions. And your childhood was short. If you were old enough to be going to school, you were old enough to just work in the field now, though.
All day, every day.
School was really a luxury for rich city-dwelling, the kids are party members, really. If you was a peasant, there was pretty much no way.
And the schooling was probably almost totally politicised as well.
Yeah, what schooling you did have, yeah. Yeah, that idea, again, that your labour belongs to the collective, and that applied to kids that were old enough to work as much as anyone else, so...
I suppose some people will judge that on balance, Mao did more good than harm.
What the hell are you talking about? Who are you talking to?